said, I've been working on the London Missionary Society for the last 10 years or so, and particularly on their museum. But what I wanted to talk about today, as coming to France, was to think about Paris and think about 1867, the Universal Exposition, and this phenomenon that happened at that point, le musée de mission évangélique, which I sort of suggest is a turning point in what I'm calling the missionary exhibitionary complex. So Rita and I were saying just before that she's sort of picking up in 1960 at one end. In a sense, I want to kind of go back 100 years or so to 1867. And 1867, I think, is positioned at some degree from the London Missionary Society point of view at the kind of the middle of what I'm calling the missionary exhibitionary complex. So the missionary exhibitionary complex, which is a mouthful, is borrowed from Tony Bennett, who's a scholar on the history of museums, has worked a lot using the ideas of Foucault in relation to museums, and his book, The Birth of the Museum, outlines some of these ideas around the exhibitionary complex. So he suggests that the institutions comprising the exhibitionary complex were involved in the transfer of objects and bodies from the enclosed and private domains in which they had previously been displayed, but to a restricted public, into progressively more open and public arenas, where, through representations to which they were subjected, they formed vehicles for inscribing and broadcasting the messages of power, but of a different type throughout society. Now, Tony Bennett's idea of the exhibitionary complex is fundamentally focused on public institutions, the development of large public museums, and in a sense the reformulation and the creation of new publics and the involvement of museums in those kind of projects of governmentality to some extent. I think Tony has a blind spot when it comes to religion, and particularly when it comes to missionaries and missionary museums. And I think that there's a significant contribution that missionary exhibitionary processes make to the exhibitionary complex, and particularly in 19th century Britain, where the missionaries are very kind of highly involved in a whole series of public discourses, and effectively are engaged in very similar processes of reform to those that the kind of social reformers are engaged in. So for Tony Bennett, the key kind of turning point in this process, which he maps out in the 19th century, is the Great Exhibition in London of 1851. And this is his text. So he argues that the Great Exhibition of 1851 brought together an ensemble of disciplines and techniques of display that had been developed within the previous histories of museums, panoramas, mechanics institutes, exhibitions, art galleries, and arcades. In doing so, it translated these into exhibitionary forms which, in simultaneously ordering objects for public inspection and ordering the public that inspected, were to have a profound and lasting influence on the subsequent development of museums, art galleries, expositions, and department stores. And that crossover between the public and the commercial is important in that degree. So in a sense, what he's sort of suggesting is that you have the Cabinet of Curiosity on the one side, and then you have the Crystal Palace, the Great Exhibition of 1851 on the other. So I think there's clearly a degree to which missionary museums are part of that, but I think there's also there's something kind of wider, and I guess what I'm interested in doing, particularly in thinking about today and thinking about science and museums and missionaries, are the ways in which some of the kind of the scientific or kind of non-religious projects that develop in the late 19th century actually borrow from and carry over things that are highly associated in their origins, at least, with the kind of religious projects of the late 18th and early 19th century in the evangelical movement. Many of the social reformers that emerged, certainly in the British context, have strong roots in these evangelical contexts, and they develop many of the ideas from what are primarily religious contexts to start with. And I think it's interesting that the 1851 exhibition doesn't specifically have a section devoted to missions. But, it's interesting that to some extent many of the ideas around that of progress, of civilization and so on, are ideas which cross over very straightforwardly into missionary rhetoric. And, the missionary exhibition, the London Missionary Society Museum, which, as I say, I've talked about, is an image of that, not from 1814, but from 1843. This is the first image we have of that museum. It moved a number of times. It was established in 1814, but it had a special opening period during the year of 1851 in the Great Exhibition, and its presence was highlighted, and visitors to London were encouraged very much to go to the missionary exhibition and to see that. So in a sense, if I position Paris 1867 in the way in which Tony Bennett positions London 1851 as a kind of key transformation point in relation to what missionaries are doing in relation to what we're calling missionary exhibitionary complex, what is that complex? What is going on, and how are missionaries using exhibition and display and the presentation of things in public contexts in the 19th century to relate to particular projects of reform and transformation within the societies? So the London Missionary Society Museum, as I say, was established in 1814. The London Missionary Society itself was established in 1795 at a time when many Protestant missionary societies were established in Britain, the Baptist Missionary Society in 1792, the Church Missionary Society. So officially, the London Missionary Society was supposed to be a non-denominational Protestant missionary society. So it was supposed to be a coming together of the Church of England, which is the kind of state church, with Congregationalists, with not Baptists, because they already had a missionary society, but of other kind of non-Church of England evangelical groups who had a sort of shared interest, in a sense, in the Christianization of the world, and saw opportunities in Britain's expanding empire to take the Christian message globally. What happened is that many other denominations founded their own missionary societies, and in a sense the London Missionary Society, although it remained non-denominational, effectively became a congregational church missionary society, certainly by the end of the 19th century. But within 20 years of foundation, they were active initially highly in the Pacific, in Tahiti, and then in South Africa from the late 18th century. Collections started to accumulate, and actually the formulation of a museum in 1814 was partly to do with the need to have somewhere to store this material, which people were collecting, bringing back to London, displaying. And I think there's a first real shift, after 1814, when the museum is established in 1818, and that is the point when King Pomare of Tahiti, is very keen to demonstrate his conversion to Christianity. He's also very keen to get hold of rifles and other kind of guns and other kinds of things. But he gives a series of religious idols, as they're classified at the time, his kind of family. From his family shrine to the Missionary Society, and says, send them if you like to London to demonstrate Tahiti. And I think that really creates a massive excitement in Britain at that point. There's a sort of tangible demonstration of missionary success, but also there's a kind of a clear rhetoric of the idol, which becomes very, very important, and the abandonment and the destruction of idols becomes a driver of the stories that are being told, the propaganda which is being used by missionary societies, but also the way in which they are displayed. So 2 years after that, this was a chapel which was being established at Carr's Lane in Birmingham. It was one of the largest congregational churches supporting the London Missionary Society. Birmingham at that stage was kind of really thriving and growing and developing as a major centre of manufacturing, and they invested massively in a huge kind of new building, effectively. And one of the things that happened, as an account that survives in a history of the life of John Angel James, who was one of the ministers of that church, that the newly built chapel was there, and these family idols of Pomare were sent up to the church. They were placed before the altar at a missionary service, and so many people crowded into this church, the new balcony, that the beams of the balcony split, and there was a sense in which actually, so it gives you a sense of just how, it's a huge building anyway, but how many people were enthused by these things, who wanted to see them. So there's a kind of a form of exhibition, a form of display, but happening in a straightforwardly kind of religious context, but interestingly transposition of something which has been a focus for religious activity in the Pacific to Britain, where it again becomes the focus of and so the way in which these idols in particular become central to missionary display and missionary presentation and fundraising efforts in the early 19th century is clearly kind of very important. And it's something which is not only confined to Britain. So one of the things that happened in the early history of the London Missionary Society, particularly in South Africa, is that they recruited Dutch and German missionaries to work at the missions, particularly because they could speak Dutch, which was, having become a British possession, it was still the main language spoken was Dutch or Afrikaans. As it became. But those missionary societies increasingly established their own organizations, and in 1832 when a mission college was established in Barmen by the Rhenish Missionary Society in Germany, there was a letter was sent by the Foreign Secretary of the London Missionary Society, William Ellis, who sent a series of objects from the Missionary Museum, idols from the Pacific, a Buddha from Rangoon, Hanuman figure from India, Chinese figure, with printed missionary text in local languages and wrapped up in a piece of Tahitian cloth. And it was suggested that they might be useful in conveying a more lively impression of the actual degradation of the heathen and the polluting character of idol worship, and also of showing the missionaries have been able to effect in the promoting the knowledge of the true God and the only Saviour. And this aspect, these two dimensions, on the one hand sort of spiritual depravity, idol worship, how much these people are in need of missionary activity, but then on the other hand literacy, translation, the production of texts, I think says an awful lot about what Webb Keane would call the kind of semiotic ideology, that in a sense you're replacing something which is illegitimate, which is focused on the kind of an object form, with text and with Bibles, particularly in the translation of the Bible, which says an awful lot about Protestantism and the way in which that was kind of imagined in the local language. But those two things come up again in 1867, but I think it's interesting that you see the roots of them at this point. We have certain hints like this of how important the display and exhibition of objects were in the early 19th century. There's not a huge amount of evidence, but another hint comes from a notice in the Missionary magazine respecting articles lent from the Missionary Museum, which says, many of these things have been lent out to friends in the metropolis and elsewhere to be used for illustration at public missionary meetings and on other occasions. They've been long detained and are needed again, so please can people send them back, basically. So it gives a sense as well that the Missionary Museum was not just a destination to which things were sent and stayed, but actually was somewhere where things were being sent out, sent back to, and being used in meetings in quite an active way across the British Isles. And there's an interesting aspect to Tony Bennett's ideas about the missionary exhibitionary complex, where he talks about the museum and the exhibition as two poles, in a sense, of a complex. At one hand you have a fixity, you have this museum in London, but you also have exhibitions and meetings happening at many different places at temporary things. And I think that is something that you can clearly see developing out of the missionary practices of the London Missionary Society. What's quite interesting before 1851 and before the second half of the 19th century is there also seems to be a degree of unease about exhibition as a form of presentation. So in 1849, a series of lectures were organised for children, and they, central to that were the props, a large missionary map of the world of extraordinary size and beauty, numerous idols and objects of missionary interest. And the speaker, who was the Reverend C.H. Bateman, evidently had some of his own gods, and by that they mean idols. It's interesting how widely these things seem to have been possessed. They were not just the property of museums, but individual supporters of the museum would be given and acquire things that came back from the mission field, which they could use in their own talks and presentations and so on. He also borrowed a number of others from the LMS Museum for the event. But he emphasised that what the props were to be used for. He says they were to give form and reality to what I'm telling them, but never as the main themes of the meeting. And he was concerned lest he be seen as a sort of puppet show man who was presenting a mere show and exhibition. So he was very concerned that this was not just an exhibition, which was seen as quite degrading and quite simple, but that what he was involved in running was children's missionary meetings, and he was going to deliver an address. And those are the kind of terms that for adult meetings, they're meetings, there's an address, it's about spoken word in many cases, but it's fundamentally about the message. It's not, there's an anxiety and a concern that this is just about the focus on objects and the presentation of objects. And I think it's interesting the ways in which that starts to transform. And as I say, I think 1867 is a key moment where the missionary exhibition as a form in its own right emerges as something which is straightforwardly about objects which people go in and see without the surrounding presentation and rhetoric that would have been there in the first half of the 19th century. So how does the 1867 exhibition develop? So the first trace that I've been able to find is this letter from Casales, the director of the Paris Evangelical Society, stating that the commissioners of the exhibition in 1867 had proposed that all the Protestant missionary societies of Europe and America should join together to make one general exhibition of articles to give an idea of the religious, intellectual and social condition of the natives amongst whom they labour before and since the introduction of Christianity, together with translations of the Bible and other printed work. And that part of the rhetoric is emphasised again and again and again. On the one hand, the presentation is of people before Christianity, an emphasis on might get refigured in later contexts as a form of authenticity, things that represented, pre-Christian traditions, particularly religious practices, but then also counterbalanced with an emphasis on what people were producing after the intervention of missionaries, and particularly with a focus on translations, texts, and the Bible, and the way in which the exhibition is formed is very much balancing those two things. The Paris Evangelical Society is making the arrangement, but all the missionary societies contribute. And in fact, they all contributed financially as well to the costs of building this pavilion and working together on them. So by January 1867, which is getting quite close to the exhibition, Theodore Vermet, who is sort of organising it for Paris, sends another letter to the London Missionary Society, and talks about the practical means, what was the state of the inhabitants of the different missionary stations in relation to their manners and their belief, and what has become of their moral and religious state since the influence of Christian missions. And then he suggests, what can you send? What's the best way of presenting that? And he goes through this list. Idols, models of primitive temples in present time, engravings and designs of the customs of the natives, maps, specimens of objects showing the rude state of industry and art, manufacture of vases, specimens of produce, costumes, arms, weapons, implements, books, works published in Europe, which are in use by the natives in various stations. So there's this kind of long list. But then he goes on to say, should there be in your collections any objects not mentioned in the list in which you think advisable to exhibit, they will be thankfully received. Send everything to us by 15th of February in order for it to be installed. So there's a sense in which he kind of opens up and says, well, actually, you can kind of send anything as long as it presents a positive aspect about Protestant missions and the way in which they operate. And there's a note in there that he, for the London Missionary Society, he's allotted 40 feet of frontage by about 8 feet high within the pavilion, but that it can be expanded and we can kind of vary things around. So it's kind of, so it's quite interesting how that then kind of unfolds. So the societies who were involved in 1867, the top part of the list and the break really is just for my benefit is to emphasise the British missionary societies and then the rest in a sense. So from the British missionary societies, you have a range of different Protestant congregations: the Wesleyans, the Baptists, the Church Missionary Society, which is Church of England, the Free Church of Scotland, and the London Missionary Society. And then you have Paris, Moravians, the Netherlands Missionary Society, Basel Mission, Danish Mission, the American Episcopal Church, and the American Association for Overseas Mission. I think it's missing out on there. So they all come together in this pavilion and they collaborate to some extent to create something. There are a number of documents. There's a catalogue which is created of all the different artefacts, but there's also a kind of a souvenir publication which has a series of images, and this is the cover from that, which they have two copies, one in the Getty and one in the Musée du Quai Branly, and they've digitized recently. So I'll show you some images and you can see some of the things which were displayed. I don't think these images are representations of the displays, but they're representations of the artifacts, and I'm imagining that actually some of these photographs may have been generated and sent in advance and then recombined. So there's a range of kind of Pacific artifacts. Some of these are recognizable from the London Missionary Society collection. The two on the outer side, one is from Hawaii, one is another from another Pacific island. They're regarded as idols, and you can see the fig leaf which has been applied to number one to kind of save his modesty. There's a lot of artifacts from India, these kind of temple models which were talked about in the list, and these representations of Juggernaut. Other objects from Hawaii, from the Pacific. This is a very famous statue now in the British Museum of A'a, which has a later history with Henry Moore and Picasso and so on. But it's interesting to see again the fig leaf and the presentation of that. But also a whole series of photographs, images that are part of the representation, and then local images again. So how was that seen, and how did the exhibition work in a sense? So there's a range of comments I've been able to pull together about what people thought about the displays. A strange medley of objects, strange, hideous, or beautiful. There's another mention that actually part of the point is that there are 6,000 Protestant missionaries preaching the gospel in over 150 different languages and dialects, and that's the message that kind of comes out of that. This one is particularly interesting, I think, this idea that within its walls many a silent missionary sermon has been preached. So that the displacement of the verbal, the vocal missionary sermon, with actually that people can look at these things and take away the message that you want them to see. And they talk about thousands of, I think 6 million people went through the exhibition in the 7 months it was open, and so thousands of people were regularly going through this. And then this comment from the Church Missionary Society that a new and strong impression of the extent and success of Protestant missions has been produced upon the visitors at the exhibition by the United Collection. So what was in the exhibition? It's quite interesting to try and sort of break it down by the different missionary societies, and you can see that the London Missionary Society really kind of dominates numerically. And I guess, I mean, the museum that was established in 1814 for a long time was called the Missionary Museum. It had a very large collection, and they seem to have sent a very large number, about 600 objects, to Paris for the exhibition. The next largest is the Wesleyans. Church Missionary Society. Paris Evangelical Society is quite large, Netherlands, and then there's kind of smaller groups here. So 3/4 of that really is British missionary societies, and I think that to some extent represents the degree to which this exhibitionary complex is a kind of an well-established part of the way in which missionary engagement is carried out in Britain. How does it break down by continent? Africa, the Pacific, more than half, Asia. So really between them, that's good 9/10 Africa, Pacific, and Asia. The Americas to some extent, but much less really. And when you break down the different missionary societies by the regional breakdowns, you can see again there that London Missionary Society is the dominant one, with actually a lot of Asian material, slightly less Pacific and less African. The Wesleyans also have a material from the Americas. The Church Missionary Society slightly different. Paris. And so on. So I think, it's very interesting that, in a sense, there's a very large amount of material from the London Missionary Society, which I think comes out of what's quite a mature dimension of using material, using objects, and what's increasingly turning into exhibitions. So one history of missionary exhibitions from the Church Missionary Society suggested that the first missionary exhibition that was held by the Church Missionary Society happened in 1867 and happened by the mission to the Jews in Britain. But I think that's kind of that history as a local history within Britain has missed out on the importance and significance of Paris in 1867. This coming together and this kind of affirmation of missionary exhibition is something that then I think was translated back to the local context in many of these countries and became a real focus for missionary activity in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century. So the Church Missionary Society really developed the local missionary exhibition on a small scale as something that local churches could do to raise money, to bring together material. The London Missionary Society became very engaged in it in the first decade of the 20th century, and ultimately it kind of eclipsed the Missionary Museum because it was much more effective at kind of raising money, at raising awareness, but also at kind of moving around and engaging with many different people. The other aspect of 1867, which I think marks a turning point, is it's also a point at which the science of ethnology really is being developed and being promoted within Britain, particularly in a museum context. So one of the people who went to see the missionary pavilion, and we know this because his notebooks have drawings and numbers which link to the catalogues from the missionary exhibition. So he was not only drawing things, he was recording the number. It was A.W. Franks, Augustus Wollaston Franks. Franks was appointed at the British Museum in the 1850s, and initially his brief was about trying to build up the British collections, the British antiquarian collections. The British Museum, as you may or may not know, didn't have very much material from Britain. It had lots of material from other parts of the world, and in a sense it was dedicated in the 19th century to developing a narrative of the development of civilization, and actually what was seen as the barbarian past of Britain was explicitly excluded from that. So British archaeological finds were excluded until about the mid-1850s from the collections of the British Museum because they didn't represent civilization. So Greece and Rome were fine, Mesopotamia and ultimately Egypt became part of that. But there was a kind of a battle, in a sense, to gain recognition for British antiquities as part of the story. But what really happens and what shifts, I think, is in this decade of the 1860s when the British archaeological remains and antiquarian remains are connected with ethnology and ethnographic work. So on the one hand, you have this book by John Lubbock, published in 1865, and the title really tells you everything you need to know. Prehistoric Times as illustrated by ancient remains and the manners and customs of modern savages. You also have this collection made by Henry Christie, who was a Quaker, an ethnologist, but also was very interested in the way in which you could explain archaeological finds, stone tools, spear throwers and so on, by looking at analogies in ethnographic material from other parts of the world. And this seems to have been a kind of a key moment in that decade of the 1860s, after the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, when there was a huge amount of work going to try and populate the longer history of humanity. And in a sense, I think what you see happening is the development of a new narrative of civilization, which embraces the kind of the early development of culture and cultural practices. And you can see this quote from Franks here from 1866, where he talks about ethnography has assumed such a totally different aspect within the last few years. Its scientific and historic value has been so fully recognised that I feel sure that whether the natural history collections be retained at the British Museum or not, it will be thought desirable to keep here the collections which, when properly arranged, will be highly attractive and popular. So before about 1850, there was material in the British Museum from the Pacific, from Cook's voyages, but it was very neglected. It was seen as being kind of irrelevant. It was put in the side, and in a sense it was also seen as representing the barbarian past, and as problematic in many ways as that British past. What you see, I think, at this point is a moment when there's an excitement and interest and a huge amount of collecting, where material that has been in part of missionary collections is being actively sought out by people like Franks, some of the first kind of professional anthropologists, ethnologists, appointed within museum context rather than university context. But Franks definitely makes it his business to visit missionary exhibitions, to document the material, and to acquire as much of this material as he can. And increasingly, material which has just been coming back and been part of networks of clientage and networks of exchange and representation within missionary context, increasingly includes the museums like the British Museum, and later in the century the Rivers Museum, the museum in Cambridge, as an avenue where missionaries can place their material and become part of this science and this kind of discipline of ethnology. And I guess what I'm kind of interested in some senses is how much is carried over from the missionary exhibitionary complex into the development of museum ethnology in the 1860s. How many of the assumptions become translated straightforwardly into the representations? So one of the things that definitely doesn't happen is, the emphasis within both from the 1830s and 1860s, the emphasis on people both before and after missionaries, that is lost as material is transferred into ethnographic, ethnological collections, with a focus primarily on the before. So what Franks is interested in about the London Missionary Society collection, which he acquires on some of the most interesting objects from his point of view in 1890 on loan, and ultimately buys a lot more material in 1910, is that they represent the first contact, the first point of contact between Europeans and people, and therefore the most authentic forms of local culture that can be. So, just as Rhys was talking earlier about the kind of the missionary histories, these things which were increasingly in the 19th century being celebrated because they were connected with key heroic missionaries who were celebrated by the Missionary Society and the focus for propaganda, those histories were stripped away from those objects. And what became important about them when they transferred into the British Museum is where they were from and what they represented in terms of a kind of indigenous culture. And in Franks' project of trying to develop this long-term chronology of the development of civilization, it was that kind of original and authentic nature which became emphasized, which was there, obviously in certain aspects of missionary presentation. But what he was not interested in and what he did not acquire was a lot of the things that you had in missionary museums, which represented the kinds of things that people produced in missionary workshops, the kinds of influences that missionaries were having, which was an equal part of the rhetoric in many missionary presentations and of the missionary exhibitionary complex. And that continues into the 20th century within missionary context. But it's quite interesting that many of the objects are increasingly being seen as remote in terms of missionary presentations. These are early 19th century materials which don't say an awful lot about the present. There's a huge interest in them from the new museums of ethnology that develop. A final point really to finish on was just wanted to kind of look at where the missionary exhibitionary complex gets to by the early 20th century in Britain. And this is a quote from a pamphlet that was produced by Keir Hardie, who was one of the first founders of the British Labour Party, so the development of socialism as a political force in Britain. He wrote this pamphlet called White Slaves, about Lord Overton. So he starts by talking about scarce a day passes in which his lordship is not presiding over, taking part in a work of mercy or heading some deputation in the interest of mortality, whether it be a lone exhibition of heathen idols in the interest of foreign mission, and that gives you a sense of how kind of common and frequent these things were in kind of local evangelical contexts, or a deputation to protest against the desecration of the Sabbath. Not only the poor and needy at home, but the dusky children of far-off lands who in spiritual darkness bow down to wood and stone are the objects of his beneficent solicitude. So he's saying this association with idols, of overseas work, of missionary activity, it's part of the presentation of a kind of bourgeois morality, which is central to kind of sort of liberal sets of ideas in which Overton. And what Hardy proceeds to do is to point out that while this kind of public presentation of, concerned Christianity is there, in fact, within Overton's factory in Glasgow in Scotland, the working conditions are absolutely, kind of terrible. People are being forced to work for very, very long times. They're actually being forced to work on Sundays, which is all sorts of contradictions. And so you have this kind of stained glass cartoon created of Saint Overton and Overtown there, which shows him as a sort of devilish figure on the right. But it's interesting in a sense how by the early 20th century, as kind of liberalism is starting to be kind of unpacked and challenged within a British political context, that the missionary exhibition is seen as being a presentation of a sort of overseas concern, but something which is increasingly being outdated as people are more interested in the political concerns within the kind of urban industrial centres. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig.